Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Lyudmila Alyabyeva. I am the chief editor of the Fashion Theory magazine, and here I present the public program, which we created for the Fabric of Felicity exhibition, which is still on at the Garage Museum, and I really recommend it, unless you have already visited it. Unfortunately, this is the final talk of our public program. But on the other hand, I am especially proud to present our today's final speaker, Professor of St-Martin's College, Kэрolайн Эванс, the author of really great books, which have not been translated into Russian, but we are working on it. And today, Kэрolайн Évans will talk about a very interesting phenomenon, which she works on with her colleagues in the framework of a research project. They are fashion films, fashion short films, which our great guest is going to talk about.
Kэрolайн, you're welcome. Thank you so much. Thank you. So before I start, I'd just like to say an enormous thank you to Garage and especially to Anna. You have to excuse my pronunciation. Is it Mihalenko? And all your colleagues, and also to Lyudmila Alyabyeva at HSE Art and Design School and the Moscow School of Social and Economic Sciences for bringing me here. And it's been just a huge pleasure, and thank you so much. So I'm going to talk for about an hour. And then there'll be time for questions. And my talk is about trying to look for some historical antecedents for fashion film today. And it really rebuts the idea that fashion film is purely the product of the digital age. And I've got between 10 and 12 film clips to show you, some old and some new. And drawing on methods from media archaeology, I want to look at a range of this film to think about fashion history as something that is multi-layered, a construction in which the past and the present are interwoven in what Mishel Fouco calls a history of the present. So the talk is really about three things. It's about film, it's about fashion, and it's about thinking about perhaps a method of looking at both that might make us see them in a new way. So let me start with a very blunt, short, and categorical definition of fashion film as a type of non-narrative film, short, presentational, dedicated to the display and promotion of fashion. So this is films from, anything from 10 seconds to 5 minutes maximum, and often distributed largely online. So I'm not going to talk about costume design for film, I'm not going to talk about documentaries about fashion designers, and I'm not going to talk about fiction film that shows fashion. All of these subjects are covered in differing degrees in a very good book that's just come out called Fashion Film by Nick Rees-Roberts. It's only been published just a few weeks ago in the UK. And my approach, I've worked with Nick on what I'm talking about today as part of a bigger research project that I'm working on in the UK with other colleagues, and I will be referring to them. And Nick was one of the speakers in the conference we had. And I think his approach and ours is compatible but different. And in fact, coming back to my definition, I think we're going to see that it's already too simplistic, but it's a starting point. So I want to show you just a film that's a minute long to start with. It's 54 seconds. I can't talk over it, so I'll just show you what I mean. Oh, sorry, that was the film, I forgot. So it's a film for Kenzo. It's made by the fashion company, and they commission a filmmaker. And I chose it partly because it's short, but partly because it also has animation and different kinds of filmmaking techniques. Is that working? Have these credits at the end, a bit like a big feature film or something. So These short presentational films are really very directly linked to the fashion industry. Some of them, like this one, are commissioned by fashion firms, but as we're going to see, it's an industry that is really in transition, that is hugely expanded and altered by new media and the possibilities that they bring for creatives. So, although fashion films like this one are often about marketing or branding or advertising, they're not only about that, and they're not always about that. So today, this kind of film spans commerce and culture. It can be made by fashion image makers, designers, by experimental or art house filmmakers, as well as by major global film directors. And as Nick Rees-Roberts says, the author of this book, today's fashion film channels the tension between the cultural forms of creativity and the economic power of commerce. So I've got a mixture of still and moving image. If I can, I'm not pressing this hard enough. Or perhaps I've got the angle wrong. No, I've got to go back. Okay, so let me very briefly outline its recent development, particularly, I guess, from my perspective in the UK. So Nick's book outlines the antecedents of fashion film from the 60s and then on into the 80s and 90s in MTV, music video, and American television fashion channels, as well as a few exceptional films by fashion photographers like Erwin Blumenfeld and Guy Bourdin in the 60s. But digital fashion film, in the way that we refer to it today, really only got going, I think, from approximately 2000. And Nick Knight, the fashion photographer who started up this website Show Studio, which now bills itself as the home of fashion film, which I think it's not completely, but anyway, that's their tagline, or always was. Nick Knight played a really important role in developing fashion film on Show Studio. So he both made his own moving images, but he also provided this platform for other London creatives working in this way. So it supported a whole range of experimental rather than commercially driven moving image projects. Nick Knight made his money shooting, commercials for companies like Dior. He didn't do this as a commercial venture. So designers like Gareth Pugh, independent London fashion designer, working with the filmmaker and artist Ruth Hogben, would be a very good example. I'm going to have to get the hang of this. What am I doing wrong? Sorry. I told you I was bad at technology, but I expect you didn't think I was this bad. Okay. So Gareth Pugh and Ruth Hogben made a series together of innovative fashion films to promote his work. And they're very experimental. They very much nod to modernist cinema. And generally, I think this type of fashion film was a very good vehicle for independent designers who couldn't necessarily afford the immense costs of a commercial fashion show, the kind you get from big, luxury firms like Chanel and Prada. Notable also is that films like this are very often not made by filmmakers coming out of the film industry. They're often made by fashion photographers, still photographers, or even graphic designers. And arguably that brings a different aesthetic and a different idea of narrativity and what a film can do to the table. And they very often use digital software to reproduce some of the earliest filmmaking techniques, which I'm going to be showing you later, like stop motion, in very creative and visually arresting ways. So all this time, for about 8 years, Show Studio is churning out a lot of films. And the big industry brands are really watching carefully, but they're sitting on the sidelines and they're not quite jumping into the water yet. Until approximately 2008, you find the big labels starting to commission fashion film. And that really consolidates it as a new genre within moving image. And I think it's ubiquitous now. And of course, the big brands had a lot more money. So in the last 10 years, fashion film has become part of a major industry, but as I said before, an industry in transition. So it ranges from the small scale and experimental, like this sort of thing, to high cost, high production value films made for the global brands, like this one. What am I doing wrong? Have I got it at the wrong angle? Okay. To there. Okay, thank you. Hopeless, sorry. Okay, so these are stills from an Yves Saint Laurent fashion film that actually, the film is made by very established fashion photographers, Inez and Vinood, so they are stills photographers rather than filmmakers. So what does commercial fashion film look like? Well, often it looks pretty expensive. It has high production values. It's short. It usually has pop music rather than dialogue, but a minority do have a script. In either case, it will have some kind of narrative or at least a very simple sequence of events. So this film is a good example of the latter, and it uses jump cuts as an editing technique in film. It uses jump cuts to show a single model descending the stairs of the couture house of Yves Saint Laurent in Paris, and with each cut, her clothes change. And it produces this very restless, jerky visual impression. And her footwork alters. It's a little bit like, if you know Jean-Luc Godard's film À bout de souffle, the jump cuts in that. So the camera's static, its distance hardly varies, though it comes in a bit closer to the model, and the editing is achieved purely through these jump cuts. In some ways it's very simple, although note it's got a couple of so-called, subliminal slides. It flashes in the YSL logo, and when it's pink you see it, but actually when it's black and white you don't see it, and there are a couple more black and white ones in this film. So although the fashion in this stark black and white film looks sleek and modern, the editing technique is strikingly like the stop motion technique used in the first films by the early 20th century trick filmmaker Georges Méliès. So Méliès actually had a magic theatre in Paris, and he used a lot of the tricks that he performed on stage or directed on stage. He imported that sensibility into his filmmaking, and he really begins to use but he's kind of, I think, very instrumental in those early stages of editing. So here, I'm afraid I've got that date wrong. It's actually 1903, and you can watch the whole film on YouTube, as you can, I think, all the films I'm showing you. But he uses stop motion, so you literally stop the camera, and these women who are all wearing kind of neoclassical dress go away, change into modern dress, come back, go in exactly the same position, and then you start the camera rolling again. And the effect is of a kind of magic trick, that they're suddenly transformed into modern dress. So in some ways, it's not that different from what Inez and Vinood are doing for Yves Saint Laurent in the early 21st century. It's a different technique. It's stop motion, rather than jump cut, but it has the same effect to produce this sort of magical transformation. So by contrast to that one, I'm getting it. This film, that was Inez and Vinood, who are photographers. This is a film made for Prada by a film director, and a very famous and well-known one, Roman Polanski. And he's not the only one, because other big-name Hollywood directors like David Lynch and Martin Scorsese have also made fashion films, particularly for Chanel, for example. So this, if you get to the end, I'm not going to, you can see it all on YouTube. It's got a script by a really well-known British writer. It features two really well-known British actors. And it's got something that you might not expect. It's got humor, as well as all these high production values and famous names. So it has a story. It has a monologue. So the actress, Helena Bonham Carter, plays a woman going to see her psychoanalyst. So she comes in and she hangs her purple Prada fur coat on the hook, and she lies down on the couch, and she starts on about her life and her husband and how terrible it all is and whatever. And you can see the psychoanalyst is basically not listening to her because he can't take his eyes off this coat. So the psychoanalyst is obviously either a Prada fetishist or a fur fetishist or a purple fetishist, I don't know, but he just can't take his eyes off the coat, and then gradually he kind of goes off to the coat rack, and the final shot is of him sort of stroking and caressing this coat, and she's still going on about her husband or her marriage or whatever. So the films that I've tried to outline, I mean, I'm trying really to make the serious point that there's a whole gamut. And as I say, you can watch them all pretty much on social media or on YouTube. But all the films that I've rather quickly skated over are really produced, commissioned by fashion firms. And you might say in that sense they're promotional, they're commercials. I mean, they're not that different from a traditional advertisement for TV, except in the way they circulate. But then there's another strand of filmmaking, and that is I referred earlier to changes in global communications and new technology, so that you have the rise now of big media firms, big media companies like Vice or Days Media, Days Digital, who are also creating fashion film. So the new fashion film has become a kind of format in its own right, and not just a form of advertising, because it's the perfect form, if you think about it, for online editors today. They're desperate for content. And the pace of production since print has kind of switched to digital is massively, massively accelerated. So Days Media they're Days Digital now, has one channel called Nowness, which is dedicated solely to film. And just to give you an idea of the scale, I found this good quote from Raven Smith, who's a London-based creative director who worked for them for 7 years. And for 3 years, he commissioned 1 film a day, every day for 3 years. That gives you some idea of the scale of these films. And Raven says, well, we've got an idea of a traditional fashion film, tired old slow motion vision of a pretty girl in a pretty dress. I'm keen to keep making films that move you and defy your expectations in that space. And this, I think, is the key point. Next, it's usual for people to think of film and fashion as separate entities, but we live more online. And there's the same audience and attention span for both. And that's the shift, I think. At Nowness, our goal is simple. We want to make films that are engaging and resonate with the audience, covering a myriad of topics through a cultural lens. And I'm going to show you a Nowness film next. But another crucial point, he says, online video is seeking you out now, not the other way around. I think that's a crucial point. People want things faster in their stream rather than having to look for it. So I'm going next to show you, and I can't talk over it because it's big, a 3-minute film from Nowness called The Way We Dress. So it's much more documentary in style, this film, and it addresses feminist questions about women's appearance in public and the way women scrutinize other women on the street. It's called Notes on the Gaze, which is a reference to the British film theorist Laura Mulvey's famous 1976 article on the male gaze. And it's made by an all-woman team. I think it really fits under Raven's rubric, he says, to make films that are engaging and resonate with the audience, covering a myriad of topics. So again, I can't talk over this one. It's 3 minutes. Oh, it is if I press the button, right? Yeah.
It's like when you see a woman across the street and you can't quite make out everything that's working, you cross her and then you see the full outfit, like the full effect, what she's radiating out to the world, and it's like so satisfying because it looks great and you just have that moment together.
I generally feel like a creep because I'll be watching someone and then I'll feel like they think I'm checking them out, and I usually kind of am, because like the fashion does attract me.
I like that feeling of putting on a character as well. You know, somewhere I'm in a Fassbinder film in my head, walking around Germany.
And I don't want other people to think I think about it too much either.
Yeah, you don't want to look like you're trying to.
No. Brutal.
I sometimes find it more satisfying for a girl to check me out than a guy to check me out.
In more recent years, I've started to just smile at people because I realize like the power of smiling at another
When I was younger,
woman.
I was always mistaken for a boy. So I thought if I put the red lipstick on,
I wore like Versace pants, these like white Versace pants.
I got it to try to
and
like
she was like, these are the
Make a
chicest
political
pants
statement
ever.
in my
Or
early
like they call it the
20s.
Monet.
I wondered if I could pull off that outfit.
kind of untouched by their surroundings.
She thinks it was.
The culture's so hostile that it's stolen like our ability to look at each other a lot of the time. So I think to kind of take that back and to smile and not feel like there's something wrong with me admiring the way someone looks in their skin and in their clothes is really beautiful.
then that's very, in some ways, typical of nowness. They make a lot of films. They may be more sort of art-based, but they're very often about questions of body size or shape or ethnicity or gender. So moving on to a very different image maker here, J.J. Guest, but staying with Raven Smith's idea of what finds itself onto your phone. As he says, people want things in their stream. They don't want to go looking for them. Here are 3 really short moving image clips for the Italian luxury goods and fashion company Prada. You'll see they're all around about 15-second mark, so don't blink or you miss them. The director, J.J. Guest, isn't a filmmaker. He's very young. He trained as a graphic designer. He has a background in installation and performance art. He lives in Britain. But he's already worked for companies like Calvin Klein, Prada, Vivienne Westwood, Mulberry, and Hermès to produce these gifts. So they're really short little films that the designers do commission, but they let go of ownership in the sense that they expect them to be circulated on social media channels like Instagram. So, yeah, there's 3 of these. So that's the first one. I think there's 2 more, and I'm going to talk through them because they're silent. So the growth of short clips like these are linked to new digital communications and the way we share visual culture now. So not only on websites, but also via social media, especially Instagram, which can accommodate these GIFs. And one thing that has really enabled this widespread dissemination of fashion film is what media theorists called intermediality. So the way images move between platforms and formats, between digital and print, and the very important role of consumers in actively disseminating them. So it's a more participatory form than when in the olden days, pre-digital, you would sort of sit and watch your television and watch a perfume advertisement or something. But looking at the films themselves in these 3, you can see JJ's interest in creating digital spaces through dissecting and relayering a single image. The films are short and rhythmic, and while they look very modern, they have something of the compelling, repetitive quality of 19th century optical toys. So it's an image that goes around and comes back to itself, very much in the way that those 19th century pre-cinematic optical toys did. So this is the second reference I've made to the very first film and its 19th century antecedents, and that's the point I want to turn to next, not just to make a simple historical comparison, but the better to understand this contemporary trend. So I'm going to talk about the earliest historical fashion film, something that Nick doesn't cover in his very good book, I think partly because that body of film is not widely known. It's very often not digitized. It's stuck in the film archive. It doesn't have any direct chronological link to fashion film today, and it's not generally thought of as fashion film, but I really want to argue to the contrary. So, oh, I've gone too far. Sorry. So these are stills from some of the films I'm going to be showing you next, but I just wanted to say, you know, Show Studio bills itself as the home of fashion film. Nick Knight, the photographer, is adamant that this is an entirely new form, that it's only been made possible by digital and that it just didn't exist before. And he's not alone. There's a very common misconception in the fashion industry that fashion film was invented with digital. Time and time again, people assume it's a format that is intrinsically linked to these new technological possibilities. But actually, you know, film was a new technological possibility only 120 years ago. It was a new technology, and the first filmmakers were just as inventive then as creatives are today at creating really striking visual effects in motion. As you can see from these stills, which are all from the first 25 years of cinema. And I'm going to show you some as a moving image, again, to give you a range of a flavor of the range and variety, and to tease out a connection to film today. So I'm just going to start with a quick definition also of historical fashion film. It's a body, because I'm not looking, for example, at fiction film, which does also have fashion in it. So it's a body of short films dating from approximately 1900-ish that increased with the advent of newsreel in 1910. Newsreel is tremendously important, and in some ways it's not that different actually from the way these media companies are producing digital channels today that need content. So French film companies would make newsreel of fashion that they would sell all around the world as part of a sort of mixed package. So you would go to the films, the cinema, and you would see a newsreel that would have certain categories in it. It would have news, current affairs, travel, and then always women's interest at the end. And that's where the fashion film went in. It was always the last bit of the program. Fashion film after 1910 starts to be produced at a very much greater quantity. But generally it spans different contexts, different modes, and as we'll see, different film genres, often linked to the fashion industry, but generally I've taken it as something that goes beyond casual recordings. I mean, there are domestic home movies from the beginning of the century, very rare, in which sometimes there's fashion, but I've sort of excluded that because I've tried to look at film that is foregrounding the latest modes for a fashion-conscious audience. So there's some sort of intentionality to it. So in other words, even before the first fashion film, if you look at other film genres, you'll see something relevant to fashion. Because one thing that's striking is that although the first film, again, I'm not getting too technical here, but film historians usually take 1895 as a starting date for, it's the first time film is shown to a paying audience. In a venue in Paris. And this is a short film by the Lumiere brothers, which shows all the workforce leaving the Lumiere film factory after a day's work. And so you see that the doors open and this flow, this tide of people flows out. And here you can see the women workers. There's no way you can argue that that's fashion film. They're respectably dressed working women leaving work at the end of the day. But you can see the visual appeal of women and textiles, women's dress in motion as these women walk out of the factory in the first moving image that the people who watched that would ever have seen. You can begin to imagine, I think, what its potential for fashion would be. But actually, fashion designers didn't like film in the beginning. They didn't pick up on that potential for a very long time. Nevertheless, I think this is comparable to images of the first fashion models walking. And there's an interesting other points to be made for another day about the absolute correlation in time between the first film, silent film, and the first fashion shows, which started almost exactly the same time. So film like this of this period is known as actualities. Editing has still to be invented, and the camera just runs in real time. And this is something you find actually in quite a lot of fashion film as well. And a lot of contemporary fashion film has something in common with film from the silent period. There's no dialogue, there's sometimes very little story. There are certain structural connections to be made. But I also talked about other genres. If there isn't fashion film now or in 1900, what is there? Well, one of them is dance film. So I'll talk over this one because it's only 30 seconds, but do keep your eye on it because it goes. And it's actually very, I think, sort of beautiful and seductive format. And what it shows you is an American actress dancing. It has nothing to do with fashion, but it's really easy again to see how much potential film would have for fashion in the way it could show female bodies and textiles in motion and in very vivid color. Okay, sorry, that's your film reference. It's made by Edison in the USA. So it's from the very late 19th century. It's hand-tinted, and look how vivid the colors are. She's an American dancer called Annabella. So it's surprising in a way that fashion designers didn't go, oh, wow, look what we could do with this. So keep this one in mind, because later on I'm going to show you a film from the 20s, again, of a model just modeling to camera. It's not dissimilar. Now I want to move straight into the next film. Which is made not much later, and this is another variety of what I referred to, another example of trick film that I referred to earlier. This one is not Méliès, who's probably the most famous trick film director, filmmaker, but this is by Segundo de Chaumont, who began making trick films in 1905. And he was a Spaniard in Paris, but he worked for Pathé, the French film company, and he specialized in adding film to color, and he produced stencil colored prints. So by this stage, you've moved from hand colouring to stencil colouring, which is still very, very labour-intensive by modern standards. And he was one of the developers of the Pathé chrome colour process, which was patented by Pathé in 1905. And what the film is, it's actually, again, a stage magic trick called metempsychosis in English, where an object or a person transforms into another. So what you're going to see is a woman who puts a bust. It's a 3-minute film, this one. I'm actually going to try not to talk through it because I think you'll miss some of the amazing transformations. She puts a portrait bust on a plinth, and this transforms into a sort of fantastical ballet system with dancing midgets, and then it's followed by a butterfly fairy who performs a number of these really dazzling transformations. Okay, it's called Transformation. So we've got musical accompaniment, which would have been very typical of the first film, even though they're silent. It would be either a lecturer giving a lecture, or someone playing music. Again, I think you can begin to see what fashion could have done with this, if only they kind of wanted to. And I think the reason, I will talk because time's passing, but I think the reason that fashion firms didn't like film in the first period is because film was still a very low cultural form. It was shown in fairgrounds and sort of popular culture venues, very working class. It took a few years for film to become more middle class, more aspirational, and to match the aspirations of the fashion designers. And actually, the very elite fashion designers don't really start using film until the 1920s. It's the more middle market ones in the 1910s, as we're going to see, that begin, and department stores, for example. But, you know, what a waste. What could they not have done with this? You can see she's got battens stitched into these beautiful. There's a lot of very interesting work to be done, I think, on textiles in the first film as well. So really what I'm suggesting is if we broaden our definition of what fashion film might have as antecedents to include other genres. I've shown you dance film, I've shown you a trick film. We could even look at animation. There's fantastic Betty Boop animation from the 1920s that's very fashion related. We could even look at ethnographic film, where European filmmakers film non-European cultures in ways that are problematic to us nowadays, but nevertheless focus very much on questions of dress and textile. There she goes, look. That's her again. Oh yeah, we're getting there. There you go, isn't that nice? I mean, it's incredibly inventive. It's easily as inventive as what fashion filmmakers are doing today. Look at that, 1907. Poor baby. So that's that film. That's the end of that one. So, oh no, there they are. I'm back again. Anyway, I think we've got the idea. So I just wanted to draw your attention to a book. One of the colleagues, I'm working on a big project on fashion film in London with two other colleagues, and one of them is Markéta Julierova, who wrote, some of these ideas are hers. She wrote this really wonderful book, or edited it, called Birds of Paradise, in 2013, and she makes exactly those points. So I think what we learn from what I've shown you, but also what Marketa argues in all her writing about film, is that this requires us to think not just about a different history in order to take account of the first film that includes fashion, but also perhaps to think of different methods. And there are precedents. I've done this a little bit in an earlier book of mine, Fashion at the Edge, but I think the most relevant one to the subject of film is this book by Marketa, where she really undermines the boundaries of cinematic genre by looking for commonalities between low-status trick film and then higher-status experimental film, and not only between different genre and types of film, but also between different decades. So she, if you like, breaks a lot of historians' rules. And she works synchronically, not diachronically. And this challenge to both genre and historical periodization enables new speculation about fashion and film, a point which I'm going to come back to, drawing on the film theorist, film historian Tom Gunning's concept of cinema of attractions. But let's just quickly get back and look at a couple of images. So I mentioned that after newsreel, after about 1910, some fashion design firms do take up this new medium. And here's an example. These are film frames from a couple, Bouessa, very famous then, although forgotten today, and Lucille. Both had fashion houses in Paris at this time. You begin, I think the first mention of fashion film is in a film magazine, Bioscope, round about 1912. Just a few of them are beginning to make use of it, but we really have to go into the 20s, and I'll show you some, to see the more elite firms like Doucet and Lanvin letting the cameras into their salons. And I've explained to you why I think that is. But I'm going to show you that in a second. But just one more film before. I want to show you a film from 1912, which you could say is quite a boring little film. It's only 1 minute and 13 seconds. But look at the color. The color is phenomenal. And it's... okay, so it uses... Oh, no. Okay, I'll tell you. Sorry, that went too fast. So it's just a minute. Look at this amazing color. It's just a film of this woman trying on hats, but it uses a system, a new invention called trichromy, that was actually first presented publicly in 1912, the year of this film. So here you do have someone really using film well, if you like, or using some new bit of technology to show fashion. And it involves photographing the same image on black and white film stock 3 times simultaneously through 3 different colored lenses, green, blue, and red, and then you project the images through a single projector with 3 lenses of those colors. I mean, you can get very obsessed, I think, with the sort of techniques, but and you can see the difference in color that it produces. And again, I think this is an example of someone who in the 1910s is understanding the potential for fashion. And this woman acting like crazy, loving these hats. And often they have little narrative scenes. They have 2 women meet and take tea, and they admire each other's clothes, and they kind of act, oh, you look nice, and they sort of show their coat and that sort of thing. So this begins to develop as a genre. That's not what I wanted. What have I done wrong? Oh, no, I think it's just slow, sorry. I need to go back. Okay, back to this. So the last film really drew attention to the filmic qualities, not only of what fashions are shown, but what cinematic techniques can be used to show them. So just quickly, if you look on the left, you're going to see these films in a minute. On the left, there's some actual fashion from 1910, but look at the color developments that go from hand tinting to stenciling. People are often very surprised to find these very vivid, strong colors used so early to show fashion. But of course, it's a perfect marriage, really. Why would you not? And secondly, on the right, new editing techniques, things like the close-up, the fade, the dissolve, all start to get used in these fashion films. So looking at these early films, you can begin to understand how technological innovation generates new cultural forms and creates new audiences and new commercial channels of dissemination, exactly like digital fashion film today. You can see that the first film is not at all a primitive form, as some early film historians said it was, but uses sophisticated methods still used today. I mean, different but similar. And this isn't an original observation. It's one I take from media theory, and especially this field called media archaeology, and what's called the new film history, although it's actually from the 1980s, not so new. But particularly writers like Tom Gunning and André Gaudriot, with their very famous theory, the cinema of attractions. And fashion film today, I think, very much like this early film, is an attractions-based format as defined by these two scholars. So their influential theory was that up to approximately 1906, the first film was not a cinema of narrative integration, as they called it, but one of monstration, that means showing. Showing, not telling. And what appealed to contemporary audiences, they argue, is the visual spectacle rather than the narrative aspect of film. So they thus re-expressed what had previously been seen, or redescribed what had been seen as sort of failing. So before that, there was a model of the development of film as being rather like human. You know, you're born an infant and goes through some sort of kind of adolescence, and then only finally reaches full maturity as narrative develops. So they argue against that linear model of growth and decline, to say that actually the first film has these original, defining, and singular features. So it's that include a very direct address to the spectator, focus on showing rather than telling, and just one quote from Gunning, he says, "It's a cinema that displays its visibility, willing to rupture a self-enclosed fictional world for a chance to solicit the attention of the spectator." And you can read more about that. He takes his title, in fact, from Sergei Eisenstein's very famous essay on montage of attractions. That's why it's called Cinema of Attraction. So since then, the term has been hugely debated, contested, redefined, and refined by a host of writers, including Gunning himself. And importantly for my argument, the concept has been extended to apply to modern forms like special effects films. And to this, I would add also modern digital fashion film is still very much an attractions-based format. But so too was much of the film of the 20s. And that's what I'm going to show you next. So this is a fashion show at Doucet, one of the more elite fashion designers, in 1923. It's stencil color again, and it's quite unusual. It's 1 minute 30 seconds. You can see this very lively modeling style. It's a color film. It's actually faded. But look at these men on this man on the left. He's a buyer. That's really unusual for the house to let the cameraman film a buyer. So you can see a sort of commercial element. These are private clients, or they're probably women acting private clients, actually. So a lot of these films that are supposedly documentary are actually acted. And often the models have a role acting clients and saleswomen. It's also really interesting for the decor at Doucet, which I don't think I've ever seen. You know, fashion historians tend not to use film as a historical source, and they really miss a trick there, because you can learn a lot that you can't learn from other sources. So this is what happens when a really high-end couture house lets the cameras in. And then this is going to finish in a second, and this is a French film shot at Doucet, and I'm going to move on to show you an American film. It's an American actress, but modeling French fashions for an American filmmaking company just a couple of years later. But you can see the possibilities of close-up, seeing clothing in motion, the kind of detail and the visual pleasure that moving image can offer. I think that's the end. So we'll go straight on to the next one. And the next one is 10 minutes. And I am going to definitely talk through it because it's quite repetitive and monotonous, although it's very interesting. But you'll see it's very kind of samey as well. So Hope Hampton is an American actress. And I cut them, but there are intertitles which are in Dutch. And that's because although the film was made by an American film company of French fashions imported to the US, and then the film is distributed, sold back to Europe, as you like, as newsreel film. And that's why it's got these Dutch intertitles, and it's a process called two-color Kodachrome. It's 10 minutes, but as I say, I'm going to talk through it. So it's a nitrate film. The actress you'll see, Hope Hampton, is a model, but also an actress and a film producer. Marketa my colleague who I mentioned earlier actually discovered this film in the George Eastman House archive in upstate New York. It was really tucked away. But as I've said, the Dutch intertitles tell us that American filmmakers had adapted it for European markets, and it would have circulated as part of a sort of mixed program of the kind I described before. So you'd have one long fiction film, and then you'd have the newsreel bit, and this would be the women's interest coming at the end. So in other words, what you see here is how Paris fashions go to America. They get filmed there, then they get shipped back to Europe, where they're watched by a mixed paying audience, a cinema audience. So newsreel film isn't really made for the kind of elite, privileged, rich women who would have been able to afford this. They're much more aspirational, these films, for a middle-class audience that wants to know what's fashionable and what the high-end French couture houses are making. And you could say in that sense, they very much resemble those little Prada gifts I showed you. I mean, I think most of the people that look at those don't necessarily buy Prada, and that's not really the point. It's not to make you want to go out and buy the clothes. It's much more about enjoying the film as spectacle, and in a more diffuse way, it becomes a sort of promotional vehicle. And similarly, I've highlighted the sort of internationalness of this film. It's the same with those little tiny Prada gifts. So they're made by a director working in the UK for an Italian brand with global sales, that's Prada, but made for mass circulation across national borders. And of course, that's what film can do for fashion. So films like this are unashamedly commercial, promotional, aspirational, and those are the very characteristics that link them to the cinema of attractions that I just described. They really function as pure spectacle rather than as narrative. And if you look at this as film, it's quite boring. And actually, that's why a lot of these films haven't been digitized, because those decisions are made by film historians. If you gave a fashion historian the budget to digitize these films, they would make some very different decisions because they would be looking for different things in the film. And that's very much what a lot of our project in London is about. So I talked about the first film known as Actualities, when you just let the camera run and the baby eats his dinner or the women come out of the factory. There's something a bit similar here, but it's the 1920s. Film has got incredibly sophisticated by this date. There are all sorts of extraordinarily complex and brilliant editing techniques that could be used, but they're not using them. So the film is just shot in the present. There's no attempt to create a narrative or any kind of cinematic time. It just shows a woman moving. It's a little bit like that early dance film in that sense, but this is fashion and that was dance. So there are no clever editing tricks. There's no camera movement, even though the possibilities are immense by the 20s. It's even, as I say, rather boring. So she performs simply, effectively. She makes a direct frontal address to the audience through her gaze and gesture. And that's something also that Gunning argues is typical of the cinema of attraction. So the fashions are really up to date, but the film is curiously old-fashioned, actually. In other words, what I'm trying to say is that the fashion film is a vestige of an earlier moment in film history that persists in the present. And my lecture title is The Grain of the Past in the Present. And that applies not only to the traces of history in today's film, but also to the traces of the past in yesterday's film. And so we might begin to think of fashion film as having the quality of a palimpsest, something that bears traces of different times or which reveals different layers or sedimentation of time. Lastly, I just want to say there's the question of colour as a form of cinematic spectacle in fashion film. So there's a Norwegian film scholar, Erik Frisvold Hansen, has argued the stylistic use of colour in newsreels in the 1910s and 20s in films like this was derived and modified from an earlier attractions-based film practices with regard to narrative integration and spectacle. So he makes that point. It's not just us. And he goes further and he argues that the use of colour in fashion newsreels like this isn't value-free, but relates to broader cultural concerns with gender. And to summarise very briefly, he argues that contemporary cultural connotations associated with colour in relation to terms used then, primitive and feminine, were both adopted and problematised in a film genre that was specifically addressed to female spectators. So on the one hand, you could argue that this type of newsreel fashion film in the 1920s is a kind of anachronism because it's so simple when film has become so complex. But in another way, it is complex because it participates in an early form of the globalization of fashion brands, something we saw in the contemporary films earlier for Prada and the stills I showed you from the YSL, the Yves Saint Laurent. So here you have the American actress models French fashions in a Dutch film, and because of the way film can travel as newsreel, it has an incredible effect on the dissemination of fashion. So I'm going to now, in the final section of my talk, try to wrap it up, although I've got more films for you. But I want to focus a little more on the reasons for juxtaposing contemporary digital fashion film and historical fashion film, reasons which are both methodological and historiographic. So I haven't outlined a straight history of fashion film like Nick does in his book, and that history certainly exists, and I really recommend his book. But I've been trying to do something else, to show a new way of looking at the past through the lens of the present, and vice versa, best described as a media archaeological approach. So here's the question, what does that mean? So I should pause to explain, and perhaps I should say it was new to me too. So in our project, we bring together three fields. We bring together fashion history, new film history, and media archaeology. And in theory, each of us are supposed to be an expert in that. So my field is fashion history, and my colleague Yossi Parika, who I'm going to be quoting in a second, is a media archaeologist. Oh, he's a media scholar, perhaps. I'm not sure how much longer Hope has got. Do you think we could move on? Could you bear that? The next slide is quite boring by comparison. I said that was boring, the next one's worse. The next one's all words. Let me just keep talking through it, and then if I need to refer to a quote, I'll move us on. So the first, perhaps obvious point is when the archaeology, in media archaeology, that doesn't refer to the study of prehistory through the excavation of sites. It's not about digging things up out of the ground. The term is used in the sense used by Mishel Foucault and his idea of the archaeology of knowledge, and to suggest a particular mode of historical inquiry which foregrounds epistemology. So here is Buesa, who you saw earlier in a still. It goes on a bit, this. I'm going to do it. Sorry, everyone. I'm going to move us on. Perhaps I'm not. Yeah, bad luck. Okay, so Yossi Parika has described media archaeology some years ago now as an emerging or recent field with the potential to provide an innovative and theoretical artistic methodology used to excavate current media through its past. So maybe you can begin to get a sense. So I've tried to actually be media archaeological by showing you the films I showed you rather than describing it in a very dry way. So this is just to pull focus on what I've done. So when he's asked what is media archaeology, he says it's an exciting theoretical opening to think about material media cultures in a historical perspective. But, and this makes it very interesting to me, it expands into an experimental, oh no, what happened? Can I be rescued? I'm going to go on talking. Thank you. It expands into an experimental set of questions about time, obsolescence, and alternative histories as well. And for me, the phrase alternative histories is very important as a fashion historian, because my particular interest is in how these media archaeological methods and theories might be used to challenge some of the methods of fashion studies, which, although it's a relatively new academic field, has often been quite orthodox in its historical methods, and that's not a criticism. There's a good reason why historians use good, well-established methods. I would never be someone to say because something is tried and tested, we have to criticize it. But it seems to me there is time to try experimenting. There's with some new paradigms in fashion history. And this seems to me a way we could do it. So another thing, when Yossi is asked, isn't it just media history that tries to rebrand itself? He says, well, not really, because it expands to strong theoretical arguments and different sorts of historical inquiry. He said, having said that, maybe interesting connections are emerging, what it can contribute as well to thinking about archives and cultural memory. So it can kind of pull in perhaps different ideas about culture and how it works. That's a really potted summary. I mean, it's a really complicated field. It isn't one thing. People argue endlessly about whether it's a subject or an approach or a method. I would just say in our project, I think we're using it as a method. And there's plenty, more to read about it. So I want to show you now a juxtaposition of two films made 90 years apart, one from 1999, and then that's Hussein Chalayan's Aeroplane Dress, filmed by Marcus Tomlinson, and this is 1999, so it's actually quite an early one. It's a 2-minute film, and obviously it's digital. I don't know if I can talk over this because it's got a soundtrack. So I don't know if I can go straight into the next one. The next one is a film from 1911 called Costumes Through the Ages. Yeah. It's a stencil color film that is 3.5 minutes long. And I'll be able to talk through this because it's it says it's black and white, but it's actually colored. And this is so common when you find stuff in the film archive because it's been so messed around that it's very hard to trace its genealogy. So essentially, I mean, this film takes the viewer in 1911 on a sort of tour of fashion through history, seen through the eyes of 1911. And this one, you might say, in some respects, is also quite boring, but I'm going to talk through it. And what I want to draw your attention to is I think you can sometimes see the turntable in the floor that the model is standing on. And it's very often used in this period, and it's not invented for film. It was used in 19th century theatre, particularly in what was called statue posing or pose plastique, where women would pose and they'd be on this theatrical machinery that would turn them around. So as with so much of the first film, filmmakers adapted a lot of technological features from the stage theatre. And as you're going to see, I think in not this film but the next, they also use mirrors, which is adapted from some 19th century photography techniques. So I think you can see the visual point I'm making in comparing these two films. They're very similar aesthetic concerns juxtaposed. They're short fashion films. They last 2 to 5 minutes each. They're both wordless. The first one had a soundtrack, and this one, though silent, would have been accompanied by live music, or more likely, actually, because this is a sort of fashion history in 1911, by a spoken lecture. And they both show motionless women revolving mechanically on the spot, and both evince a fascination with the new technologies available for showing fashion in motion. So obviously this is shot on film and the first is digital. But although this is only shot something like 16 years after the first film was shown, they're both fairly early examples. And what I'm going to do in my next, when this is over, is isolate two frames from these two films to make some more points about them. And I think we're going to just move on because this, or maybe we should get to the end. I'll try and talk through this. One thing I would say is, while I've tried to talk about all these films as examples of new technologies of the image, I'm emphatically not making a point here about origins of either the first film or the first digital imagery. So what underlies these juxtapositions throughout this talk is the gradual encounter of fashion and film from approximately 1900 to 1910 and onwards, and then again from approximately 2008. So really, the juxtapositions just highlight two parallel moments in the early 20th and 21st centuries when the emergence and intensification of new technologies of the moving image began to impact on the commerce and culture of fashion. Here we are in 1911. This is the modern day fashion of this film. And you see three women together in really up-to-the-minute 1911 fashions revolving on this turntable. So Marketa, who I referred to earlier, has developed a concept to explain this, which she calls delayed emergence. And what she argues is that the 20th century fashion industry at the time of this film and later never really made fashion film their own until the digital age, which created the ideal conditions for a new cultural fit of an old medium. Okay, so this is a different film here, you can see on the right, but I put it in because it's just 3 years earlier, and it's the same visual trick. It's the revolving on a platform, and what's particularly good about this frame is that it sort of reveals its technology. It's less successful in a way, if you like. So you can see there's a single model who would revolve on a turntable, and behind her are two mirrors, and this is very often used in 19th century photographic studios, and they create this visual illusion together of three women revolving who are filmed in this rather beguiling way. So, let me end with a quote from a book by a film historian, Thomas Alsacer, who wrote an entire book called The New Film History as Media Archaeology, where he writes, perhaps it's advisable in the case of the cinema and its encounters with television and digital media, we could say today, to speak not only of a past and a present and a future, but also of an archaeology of possible futures and of the perpetual presence of several pasts. So what should I do? Shall I stop there because I've done an hour? I mean, I could go on another 5 minutes and show you two more films. Do you want to see two more films, or are you? But okay, I'll tell you what. I'll skip my long conclusion, where I was really just trying to sum up what I've just said, and maybe if you have any points to make, we can. I'll keep it there to refer to. So I just want to show you two examples, really. Back to Nick Knight, who I opened with. These films are about a couple of minutes each. So this is an early film, I guess you could call it a fashion film from Nick Knight, but he's really just playing with the new possibilities of digital moving image in this very short film that's based on a particular kind of British chocolate wrapper. It's a brand called Quality Street that we all know from childhood. Everyone has Quality Street, and if you grew up in Britain, you know these wrappers, you know what they are. And then I want to end on another last very nice trick film, and so I'm asking you, I suppose, to make some visual connections between the two. But you can see very much this is a fashion photographer really playing with the possibilities of digital moving image and to see what he can do. And I really want to give you these two films as a beginning to answer, my final question would be to say, can we stage a dialogue between these two forms separated by 100 years that are very different? I would not argue for a sort of collapsing of historical conditions, because they're produced by very different historical conditions and there are very significant differences in context and meaning. But nevertheless, can one begin to think of some kind of interface between the two, if only also to rethink questions about origins and teleology and the sort of linearity sometimes of film history. It's a bit like that 19th century technology where you get back to something circular that repeats and goes round. And then the next film, which is only 1 minute 40 seconds, then I'm done, is by filmmaker Gaston Blair, he was also a kind of pioneer of special effects in his day, and he was the principal trick film director at Pathé in 1904, the year of this film, where I think you can see he plays equally creatively with the technical potential of a brand new visual technology and an emerging cultural form. It's called Metamorphosis, which means change, obviously. And this would have had a musical accompaniment or some kind of speaker, but I'm going to let you just watch it. Hand-colored, I think. That's it. Thank you so much. So I believe if there are questions, I listen on the Russian telephone. I feel like a spy or something. Is that right? Okay.
Если у кого-то есть вопрос, поднимите, пожалуйста, руку, мы передадим микрофон.
Большое спасибо за интересную лекцию.
Thank you very much for the great talk. My question is about the boundaries of genres. When we work with short videos, short films that were created in the digital era, it's one situation and one context, right? But what about the films of the beginning of the 20th century? They are also about fashion and about visual spectacle, basically. And this visuality dominates narrative, as you said. Do you think they can be called short films because both Méliès' films and later films like Max Lintier's film of 1911, they are also short, but that's only because of the technical possibilities of the era, because they just couldn't create the long, full-length feature film. Do you think they are comparable, or are they different because of the technical possibilities of the time?
I think it's a good question because I think it's important also to highlight the differences, which I didn't do. So I don't know if you're a film expert or scholar. I suspect you know more than me because I'm much more from a fashion background. But I think that I don't need to talk into this, do I? Sorry, I get confused. I just realized I'm not on the telephone because you're there. So, sorry, the question is about genre. I mean, I think maybe one way to think about that is the degree to which those early filmmakers were or were not commercially successful. So someone like Méliès, who is unbelievably inventive and brilliant, in my personal opinion, never quite made it in the way that the Pathé firm was super, commercially geared up and able to distribute their films and really marketed and sold them much more effectively. And I'm just wondering if one would have to think through in more detail the specificities of those differences, wouldn't one? But also one could, I started out by talking about contemporary film, and some of which was not commercial and some was. And actually, you know, the only reason that Nick Knight made that website is because it was his personal passion. And he funded it. He paid all the salaries out of the, you know, what he earned as a very successful fashion photographer, working for big luxury brands and doing advertising for an editorial. So one question, I suppose, is about the degree of commercial success, and then the other one you asked is about differentiating between genre, I think, didn't you? And I don't know that I can answer that, as well as I don't know if you have any more to say about that, because I think it's a really good question, but I'm wondering what those genres were made for. I mean, I think it's partly to do with the way they were sold again. So the film cataloguers, that's how you know, because they're branded, as it were, or classified then in the film catalogues when the filmmakers are selling their films. They come under categories which is dance or trick film. I think it was quite a functional device to make a list. But there may be other people here know more than me about film genre, early film genre. Oh, okay, telephone.
Thank you very much for your lecture. Unfortunately, I realized that I was half an hour late because I trusted the time pad, which designated the time as 16:30, so I missed the beginning. But can I still ask a question?
Of course you can.
The question is about this term, media archaeology, and as I figured out from what you said at the second part, it's a sense to Mishel Foucault's notion of genealogy of knowledge, of genealogy of concepts, in the way that the previous concepts or the notions from the past instruct contemporary or later concepts. And in this, if it's true, I would probably go further down. And actually, you mentioned theater as the source or the origins of this media or images, which was demonstrated in your last film, where the simulator of Loie Fuller danced. Loie Fuller wasn't herself, I think. It was
no, she's an American Annabella something.
And this mise en scène and the particular effect she created for theater, for her own theater, in the Paris fair.
Yeah.
So perhaps all this fantastic, the dream world that both cinema authors and fashion artists try to imitate, they have a much earlier origins in the theatre fairy tales, let's say.
Yes, absolutely. The féerie, as they were called, is a genre in the theatre that gives rise to these trick films. Straightforwardly, that's certainly true, and I think one strand of media archaeology is concerned very much in not creating a history of media which is sort of hermetic, which actually connects to unexpected other technologies, even sciences, which may connect synchronically rather than diachronically. I think another strand of media archaeology is about very much looking at the overlooked. If you look at something that hasn't ever really been under the microscope, suddenly you change the narrative of history by changing the focus of your lens. So I think it's potentially, that's why I tried to argue, a very fruitful field more generally for fashion history, which is my area, because it might give you a different method or a different way of looking at things, or make you look at different things. As you say, I mean, in my own work over the last few years, because I trained as an art historian, I started out very much thinking of fashion as an image or an object. And gradually, actually, through writing a history of the first fashion shows, which are exactly the same time as these films we've been looking at, I've come to think of fashion much more as a kind of performance. And funnily enough, when I was thinking about modernism, my art historical training and knowledge did not help me at all, because if you go to art histories of modernism, they're all about the sort of historical avant-gardes. They kind of don't work for fashion. And what I found was by going towards a whole sort of bibliography of theatre, dance, performance, even music actually, gave me a different insight. So I don't know if that answers your question, but I think it is, I agree. I mean, I think sometimes it's just as simple as looking through a different lens, but although it's simple to say, it's difficult to do because we get set in our vision and it's very hard sometimes to refocus. And when you do, you see something different.
Ну, если вопросов больше нет, thank you very much again.
Oh, okay. Thanks to you. Thank you so much.